At 2:15 a.m. on March 17, 1945, Sergeant Frank Dietrich crouched in the shadows outside Stalag VII-A's administration block, gripping a combat knife with a blade no longer than his palm. 9 SS guards patrolled the perimeter between him and the intelligence cache that could save 4,000 Allied prisoners. In the next 90 seconds, that knife would drop every single guard without a gunshot, without a scream, and without a single Wehrmacht soldier understanding what killed them, until British pathologists examined the bodies 6 weeks later and discovered something that would rewrite close-quarters combat doctrine for the next 8 decades. The guards never heard him coming. They never had a chance to raise their weapons. And by dawn, the compound's entire security apparatus would be hunting a ghost who'd already disappeared into the forest with documents proving the location of 3 undiscovered extermination facilities. But Frank Dietrich hadn't learned to kill silently in any military training program. He'd learned it 14 years earlier, in the basement of his uncle's butcher shop in Cleveland's Slavic village, where a 12-year-old boy had discovered that the fastest way to process livestock was to sever very specific blood vessels in very specific ways, and that once you understood mammalian anatomy, the technique transferred to any warm-blooded creature that stood on 2 legs or 4. Frank Dietrich was born in 1914 to Polish immigrants who'd settled in Cleveland's industrial corridor, where steel mills turned the sky orange and the Cuyahoga River caught fire twice before he turned 16. His father worked the blast furnaces at Republic Steel. His mother took in laundry from the foremen's families. His uncle Max ran a butcher shop on East 65th Street that serviced the neighborhood's Polish, Czech, and Slovak communities, families who wanted their kielbasa made the old way, who demanded blood sausage that tasted like home. Frank started working the shop at age 11, swept floors, carried ice, scrubbed the cutting tables until his hands cracked from the lye soap. By 12, Max had him in the back room, teaching him the knife work that separated a butcher from a meat cutter. "You don't hack," Max said in Polish, demonstrating on a hanging beef carcass. "You find the seam. You follow the blood. You cut what needs cutting, nothing extra." The boy learned fast, found he had a feel for it, understanding where the arteries ran, how the muscle groups connected, which cuts bled fast and which bled slow. He could process a hog in 8 minutes, could break down a steer in under an hour, could feel the resistance change in his blade when he hit different tissue densities. "Good hands," Max said. "Steady. Most men, they get squeamish. You don't." Frank didn't. He found the work honest. You killed the animal clean. You used every part. You charged a fair price. There was a logic to it, a geometry of flesh and bone that made sense when nothing else in the world did. He was 17 when the shop was robbed. 3 men, late at night, after closing. Max in the office counting the week's receipts. Frank in the back, scraping down the cutting tables. He heard Max's voice rise, heard the impact of something heavy against the office wall, moved without thinking, grabbed the boning knife from the sink where he'd been cleaning it, 6 inches of flexible steel, thin enough to slide between ribs, sharp enough to split a hair. Found the first robber going through the register. The man turned, saw a skinny kid holding a knife, laughed. Frank drove the blade into the man's femoral artery, with the same precise angle he'd use on a hanging carcass. Felt the resistance, knew he'd hit it clean, stepped back. The robber looked confused, looked down at his leg, sat down hard, bled out in 90 seconds. The other two ran. The cops called it self-defense. Max called it necessity. Frank called it nothing at all, just the application of knowledge he'd already possessed, used on a target that happened to be human instead of livestock. He never talked about it. Went back to work the next morning, processed 3 hogs and a beef, washed the blood off his hands, and went home for dinner. When the war came in 1941, he enlisted because the steel mills were closing, and the butcher shop wasn't making enough to support 2 families. He was 27, too old for the infantry's preference, too working class for officer training. They put him in intelligence, OSS eventually, because he spoke Polish and German from the neighborhood, because he could read maps, because he didn't panic under pressure. They trained him in espionage, in infiltration, in codes and signals. They never asked if he knew how to kill quietly. They assumed he'd need to be taught. Frank said nothing. Learned what they wanted to teach him. Kept the other knowledge to himself. By 1943, he was running intelligence operations behind German lines. Sabotage, document retrieval, prisoner extraction. The work required silence more often than firepower. A gunshot brought patrols, but a body that didn't start screaming until you were already gone bought you hours of head start. The OSS issued him weapons. A Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife, double-edged, 7 inches, designed by British commandos for silent killing. He used it twice, found it clumsy. The blade was too rigid, the grip wrong for the kind of precision work he understood. It was designed for stabbing. He didn't stab. He cut. He requisitioned a standard USMC K-bar instead. 7-inch blade, single edge, flexible enough to feel what you were cutting. Modified the grip with electrical tape until it fit his hand the way the boning knife had fit in the shop. Kept the edge sharp enough to shave with. Used it the way Uncle Max had taught him, finding the seams in human anatomy, the same way he'd found them in beef cattle. Femoral artery for the legs, carotid for the neck. Subclavian, if you could reach it. Cuts that bled fast and quiet. Cuts that dropped a man in seconds without the thrashing that alerted nearby sentries. He killed 14 German soldiers this way between June 1943 and March 1945. Guards, sentries, officers caught alone in the wrong place. Each time, he used the same technique, precise angles, specific depths, cuts designed to sever major vessels without hitting bone or cartilage that might deflect the blade or make noise. Each time, the bodies were found hours later by Wehrmacht patrols who couldn't understand how a man could bleed to death so quickly from wounds that didn't look severe. Narrow incisions, minimal surface damage, but catastrophic internal bleeding that killed in under 2 minutes. German intelligence issued reports. Allied operatives using advanced surgical techniques. Speculation about specialized medical training. Analysis of wound patterns. They never considered that the technique came from a butcher shop in Cleveland, that the man killing their soldiers had learned the anatomy on pigs and cattle before he'd ever applied it to humans. Frank read the reports through captured documents, said nothing, kept working. But by early 1945, the OSS wanted something more than corpses in the woods. They wanted intelligence from inside Stalag VII-A, a POW camp near Moosburg that held 4,000 Allied prisoners, and, according to intercepted transmissions, contained documentation about 3 extermination facilities the SS hadn't destroyed yet. Locations, operational details, evidence. The camp was too well guarded for a raid. too deep in German territory for an extraction team. But a single operative, moving at night, could penetrate the perimeter, could access the administration building where the documents were stored, could retrieve them and disappear before the garrison understood what had happened. They needed someone who could kill 9 guards in under 2 minutes without alerting the compound. Frank's commander showed him the camp layout, aerial reconnaissance photos, guard rotation schedules. 9 men between you and the objective, the commander said. Sentries positioned 30 yards apart, overlapping sight lines. You take one down, the others see it. Unless they don't, Frank said. You can't knife 9 men before they raise an alarm. I can if I do it right. The commander studied him. What's right look like? Fast cuts, specific targets. They drop before they know they're hit. You've done this before. 14 times. Not 9 at once. Same principle, larger scale. The commander approved the mission, gave him 2 weeks to prepare. Frank spent the time studying human anatomy texts from the OSS Medical Library, not to learn what he didn't already know, but to confirm that military physicians understood the same vascular geography he'd learned in the butcher shop. They did. The textbooks used different language, but the principles were identical. Sever the femoral artery, and a man has 90 seconds of consciousness before blood pressure drops below functional threshold. Sever the carotid, and you have 30 seconds. Hit the subclavian, hidden beneath the clavicle, and you have 45 seconds. But the victim usually doesn't realize he's been cut until he's already losing coordination. Frank made a list, memorized the guard positions, calculated the approach angles, timed himself with a stopwatch on a practice course, using sandbags as targets, worked until he could move through 9 positions in 70 seconds. Cut, step, cut, step, cut. March 16th, 1945. The OSS inserted him 6 miles north of Stalag VII-A. He moved through the forest after dark, carrying nothing but the Kabar knife, a suppressed well-rod pistol for emergencies, and a canvas satchel for the documents. He reached the perimeter at 1:45 a.m., settled into the tree line, watched the guard rotation for 30 minutes, confirmed the patterns matched the reconnaissance reports. 9 guards, 3 on the western fence line, 2 at the administration building entrance, 4 patrolling the interior compound. Searchlights swept the perimeter every 40 seconds. Guard positions overlapped. If one fell, the others would see it within 10 seconds, unless they all fell within the same 10 seconds. Frank waited until the searchlight passed, moved. Climax begins, 3,000-word mark. The first guard stood 20 feet inside the fence line, rifle slung over his shoulder, smoking a cigarette. Frank approached from behind, angling right to avoid the man's peripheral vision. Closed the distance in 4 seconds. The guard turned his head at the last moment, some animal instinct, sensing movement. Too late. Frank's left hand clamped over the guard's mouth. The K-bar came up in his right hand, blade angled 30 degrees from horizontal, and drove into the subclavian artery beneath the man's clavicle. Felt the resistance change as steel parted tissue. Felt the warmth against his knuckles as pressure released. The guard's body went rigid. Frank held him upright for 3 seconds while the blood pressure dropped, then lowered him silently to the ground. The cigarette was still lit. He crushed it under his boot. 7 seconds elapsed. The second guard, 15 yards east, hadn't noticed. Frank moved, low, fast, using the shadows cast by the searchlight tower. The second guard was younger, nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Frank came from his right side this time. The man was left-handed, rifle positioned wrong for a quick response. The K-bar went into the femoral artery, severing it completely in a single draw cut that started at the inner thigh and pulled toward the hip. Massive hemorrhage. The guard opened his mouth to scream. Frank's hand was already there, crushing the windpipe before sound emerged. Felt the man's legs collapse, lowered him, moved. 14 seconds. The third guard on the fence line stood near a storage shed, sheltered from the wind. Frank approached from the shed's far side, using the structure to mask his movement. This one required different geometry. The guard was facing partly toward him, impossible to approach from behind without being seen. Frank picked up a stone, threw it 10 feet to the guard's left. The man's head snapped toward the sound. Muscle memory, training, exactly what Frank wanted. The moment the guard's eyes tracked the sound, Frank closed the distance. Came from the right. The K-bar entered below the ear, angled down and forward, severing the carotid artery and jugular vein simultaneously. Catastrophic blood loss. The guard's hands came up fumbling, already losing coordination. Frank caught him under the arms, guided him down. 22 seconds. The searchlight was sweeping back. Frank pressed flat against the storage shed, counting the seconds. The light passed. He moved toward the administration building. 2 guards at the entrance, 30 feet apart, facing outward. More alert than the perimeter sentries. Both carried MP-40 submachine guns at low ready. Both had clear sight lines of each other. Frank couldn't take them sequentially. If one went down, the other would see it. He needed them both incapacitated within 2 seconds of each other. Waited in the shadows, calculating angles. The searchlight was 40 seconds from its next pass. The guards weren't talking. Professional. Dangerous. Frank's hand closed on the hilt of the K-bar. Felt the electrical tape under his palm. Uncle Max's voice in his head. Find the seam. Follow the blood. He moved from the shadows at a dead sprint. No stealth. Pure speed. The distance closed in 3 seconds. Faster than human reaction time when the target isn't expecting frontal assault. The first guard's eyes widened, started to bring the MP-40 up. Frank's blade was already moving. Drove into the femoral artery with enough force to sever it completely. Felt the edge scrape bone. Ripped the knife free and pivoted. The second guard was turning, beginning to shout. Frank covered the 6 feet between them before the sound fully formed. The K-bar came up in an underhand arc, entering beneath the sternum and angling upward, searching for the descending aorta. Found it. The guard's shout cut off mid-syllable. Blood pressure dropping too fast to sustain consciousness. Both guards collapsed within 3 seconds of each other. Frank caught the second man's MP-40 before it hit the ground. The clatter would bring the interior patrol. 38 seconds. 4 guards left. Interior compound. Mobile. Unpredictable. Frank pulled the administration building door open. Stepped inside. The corridor was dark, lit only by a single bulb at the far end. He moved toward it, knife ready, blood still wet on the blade. Voices ahead. German. 2 men talking. Casual conversation about leave schedules and beer rations. The guards were in the main office, 20 feet from the document storage room. Frank couldn't avoid them. The only route to the target went through their position. He assessed options, counted heartbeats. The searchlight would complete its cycle in 32 seconds. When it swept the entrance and found the dead guards, the alarm would sound. He needed the documents and clear distance before that happened. No time for subtlety. Frank stepped into the office doorway. 2 guards, both seated, both with their rifles leaning against the desk. Both looked up, recognized he was an SS. Started to rise. Frank threw the caw bar. He'd never practiced knife throwing. Butchers don't throw their tools. It damages the edge, warps the balance. But distance was 12 feet, and the target was center mass, and he didn't need precision, just disruption. The blade tumbled once and buried itself in the first guard's chest. Not a kill shot, but shocking enough to freeze the man's partner for the 2 seconds Frank needed to cross the room. His hands found the second guard's throat, drove thumbs into the windpipe, felt cartilage collapse. The man thrashed, hands clawing at Frank's wrists. Frank held pressure until the thrashing stopped, then pulled the caw bar from the first guard's chest and opened the femoral artery with a single practiced cut. 51 seconds. 2 guards remaining, somewhere in the compound. Frank moved to the storage room. The door was locked. He kicked it open. Stealth was finished. Speed was everything now. The room contained filing cabinets, dozens of them. He pulled the nearest drawer. Personnel files. Wrong section. Tried another. Supply manifests. Wrong again. The documents he needed would be classified separately. Hidden. He scanned the room. Saw a steel safe in the corner, half concealed by a tarp. Combination lock. No time to crack it. Frank grabbed a fire axe from the emergency station in the hallway. Returned to the safe. Swung the axe into the lock mechanism with enough force to dent the steel. Second swing. Third. The lock housing cracked. Fourth swing tore it completely free. The door swung open. Inside, document folders marked with SS insignia, camp transfer records, prisoner transport schedules, and beneath them, 3 manila envelopes, stamped with red classification markings. Frank grabbed them, shoved them into the satchel. Footsteps in the corridor, running. The remaining 2 guards responding to the axe impacts. Frank turned as they entered. Both had their rifles up. Both fired. The rounds went high, rushed shots, poor light, targets moving. Frank dropped low, rolled behind the filing cabinets. Came up with the well-rod pistol, suppressed barrel tracking the first guard, fired twice, center mass. The guard went down. The second guard was smarter, ducked back into the corridor, shouted for reinforcements. Frank had perhaps 30 seconds before the garrison arrived. He moved to the window, kicked it open, dropped 12 feet to the ground outside, and started running. Behind him, the compound alarm began to wail. Searchlights swept the ground. He heard dogs barking, guards shouting, the sound of vehicles starting. The perimeter was sealed. Every exit covered. Frank ran towards the eastern fence line, opposite direction from his insertion point, away from the obvious escape route. Found the section where the fence met the tree line. Climbed. Felt the barbed wire tear through his jacket, his skin. Dropped on the far side and kept moving. 73 seconds from document retrieval to perimeter breach. 9 guards dead. 0 shots fired until the final encounter. And the SS had documentation of 3 extermination camps now in Allied hands. Frank disappeared into the forest as the camp's garrison mobilized behind him. He moved north for 2 hours, then doubled back south, then west. Classic evasion pattern. Reached the extraction point at dawn. The OSS team was waiting. "You get them?" the team lead asked. Frank handed over the satchel. Said nothing about the 9 bodies he'd left behind. The documents reached Allied intelligence within 48 hours. Confirmed the locations of 3 facilities the SS had tried to conceal. processing centers where they'd been destroying evidence before the advancing Soviet forces could document the operations. British forces reached the sites within a week, found the gas chambers, found the crematoriums, found the mass graves. The evidence made it to Nuremberg, helped convict 12 SS officers who'd sworn the facilities didn't exist. Frank Dietrich's name never appeared in any report. Aftermath begins 3,500 word mark. The OSS filed the Stalag VII-A operation as a successful intelligence retrieval conducted by an unnamed operative. Frank's commander recommended him for the Silver Star. The recommendation was denied. OSS operations were classified, and medals required public documentation of actions that couldn't be made public. Instead, Frank received a promotion to lieutenant and a reassignment to training operations. The war ended 3 months later. The OSS dissolved. Frank returned to Cleveland in September 1945 with an honorable discharge, 37 months of combat pay, and no desire to discuss what he'd done in Europe. His father had died while he was overseas. His mother had moved in with his sister's family in Parma. Uncle Max was still running the butcher shop, but the neighborhood had changed. Younger families moving out to the suburbs, the old Polish community dispersing, the steel mills starting their long decline. Frank asked for his job back. Max gave it to him without hesitation, welcomed him back to the cutting tables and the walk-in freezer and the smell of fresh sawdust on the floor. The work was the same. The knife techniques were the same. But Frank's hands had changed. Or perhaps the work had changed. He found himself hesitating before certain cuts, feeling the resistance in the blade differently, remembering the way human tissue felt compared to beef or pork. He never froze, never stopped working, but the automatic quality was gone, replaced by something more deliberate, more conscious. He thought about each cut now, considered it, then executed it cleanly. Max noticed, said nothing. The neighborhood noticed, too. Word had spread that Frank had been OSS, had done intelligence work behind enemy lines. People treated him differently, respectfully, but with a distance that hadn't existed before. Men who'd known him since childhood now nodded carefully when he entered a room. Women watched their children around him. Frank ignored it, came to work at 4 a.m., processed meat, served customers, cleaned the equipment, went home to the small apartment he'd rented on East 79th Street, ate dinner alone, slept poorly. In December 1945, 2 men in suits came to the shop, federal agents. They asked Max if they could speak with Frank in private. Max pointed them to the back room. "Sergeant Dietrich," the first agent said, "we're with the War Crimes Investigation Division. We need to ask you about Operation Stalag VII." Frank set down the boning knife he'd been sharpening, wiped his hands on his apron. "I signed non-disclosure papers." "The papers are still in effect. We're not asking you to break classification. We're asking about technique." "What technique?" The second agent opened a briefcase, pulled out photographs, crime scene images. 9 bodies from Stalag VII-A, photographed after the camp was liberated, close-ups of wounds, detailed medical examiner notes. "The German doctors who performed the autopsies were confused," the agent said. "Knife wounds consistent with surgical precision, vascular injuries that caused massive hemorrhage, but minimal external trauma. They couldn't understand how a single operative killed 9 guards without making enough noise to alert the compound." Frank looked at the photographs, said nothing. "We need to know if this technique can be documented," the first agent continued. codified, taught to other operatives. The war's over, but the intelligence work isn't. We're building training programs. We need experts. I'm a butcher, Frank said. You're a specialist in human anatomy with combat experience. The military needs that expertise. For what? For the next war, the one we're already fighting in the shadows. Frank closed the briefcase, handed it back. I don't teach that. Why not? Because it's not something you teach. It's something you learn over time, working with your hands, understanding tissue. You can't put it in a manual. You can't demonstrate it in a classroom. It requires feel, judgment, things that come from experience, not instruction. We'd pay well. I'm not interested. The agents left, returned twice more over the next year, with increasingly generous offers. Frank refused each time. He had no interest in returning to that world, in sharing techniques that had originated in Uncle Max's shop, and ended with 9 Germans bleeding out in a POW camp. In 1947, the shop started struggling. The steel mills were laying people off. The neighborhood was emptying. Customers stopped coming. Max tried to hold on, but by 1948 he was 2 months behind on rent, and the suppliers were demanding payment up front. Frank offered to buy the shop, used his military pay and a GI Bill loan, became the owner in March 1948. Changed nothing about the operation. Same products, same hours, same sign on the door. But business continued declining. He supplemented the income with freelance work, butchering for restaurants, processing deer for hunters during fall season, teaching knife skills at the culinary school that had opened near downtown. The teaching was different from what the federal agents had wanted. This was honest work, showing culinary students how to break down a chicken properly, how to trim a tenderloin, how to make clean cuts that preserved the meat's quality. The students knew he'd been in the war. Some of them asked about it. Frank deflected the questions, focused on the technique they were learning, emphasized precision over speed, understanding over force. The knife is a precision tool, he'd tell them. You don't hack. You find the seam. You follow the structure. You cut what needs cutting, nothing extra. The same words Uncle Max had used 15 years earlier. In 1951, a reporter from the Cleveland Plain Dealer came to the shop. Wanted to do a story about neighborhood businesses run by veterans. Frank agreed to be interviewed under the condition that his military service remained vague. The article ran in June, described Frank as a quiet man who learned his trade from his uncle and served his country with distinction. Made no mention of OSS operations. Made no mention of anything beyond honorable service. 3 days after the article published, Frank received a phone call. A British voice, accent refined, asking if he was the Dietrich who'd conducted operations in Bavaria in 1945. Frank hung up. The man called back. Frank disconnected the line entirely. A letter arrived 2 weeks later. British intelligence. They'd been investigating Stalag VII-A as part of war crimes documentation. They'd interviewed surviving German guards. One guard, who'd been off duty during the raid, described finding the bodies, described the wounds, mentioned that Wehrmacht medical officers had been disturbed by the precision. We believe, the letter stated, that your technique represents a significant advancement in close-quarters combat methodology. We'd like to discuss potential collaboration on training materials. Frank burned the letter. Never responded. In 1952, he married a Polish girl from the neighborhood, Helena Kowalczyk. Her father owned the hardware store on Fleet Avenue. She worked as a secretary at Republic Steel's administrative offices. They met at church. She knew about his military service. The neighborhood talked, but she never asked for details he didn't offer. They bought a house in Garfield Heights. Frank continued running the shop. Helena kept working. They had a daughter in 1954, named her Marie after Frank's mother. The shop closed in 1958. The neighborhood had changed too much. The customer base had dispersed too far. The supermarkets were offering pre-cut meat at prices Frank couldn't match. He sold the building and the equipment, took a job as a meat cutter at one of those same supermarkets. Steady pay, benefits, no ownership headaches. He worked there for 22 years, became the senior cutter, trained new employees, maintained his precision, never discussed his background unless directly asked, and then only in the vaguest terms. Customers occasionally recognized his name from the 1951 newspaper article. Asked about his military service, Frank smiled politely and changed the subject. In 1963, a military historian from Case Western Reserve University contacted him. Researching OSS operations in Bavaria. Had Frank's name from declassified documents. Wanted to interview him about Operation Stalag VII. Frank agreed to meet. Answered questions factually, but without detail. Confirmed dates, locations, objectives. Declined to discuss methodology. "I'm trying to understand how a single operative achieved what you achieved," the historian said. 9 guards eliminated without alerting the compound. It's unprecedented in intelligence operations. "I had good training," Frank said. "OSS training doesn't cover that level of precision." "Then I had good instincts." The historian published his book in 1967, devoted 3 pages to Operation Stalag VII, called it one of the most successful infiltration operations of the war, but noted that specific tactical details remain classified. Frank's name appeared once in a footnote. The book sold poorly. Frank never read it. In 1972, a military training manual was published that included a section on silent elimination techniques. The techniques bore striking similarity to the methods Frank had used. Emphasis on vascular targets, specific angles of approach, timing based on human physiology. The manual credited field observations from multiple operations, but provided no attribution to specific operatives. Frank learned about the manual when a former OSS colleague called him. "They're teaching your technique," the colleague said. "Every special operations soldier learns it now. It's standard doctrine." "Good," Frank said. "Maybe they'll use it to save lives instead of taking them. You could claim credit, get recognition." "I don't want recognition. I wanted the war to end. It did." He hung up. Never mentioned the conversation to Helena. Frank retired from the supermarket in 1980. Spent his retirement years working in his garden, playing with his grandchildren, attending church. He avoided veteran organizations, declined invitations to speak at military events, made no effort to connect with former OSS personnel. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. Frank watched the news with quiet satisfaction. The Cold War had ended without the apocalypse everyone had feared. The shadows he'd operated in 40 years earlier had finally retreated. That same year, a documentary film crew from PBS contacted him. They were producing a series on OSS operations. They'd interviewed dozens of veterans. Frank's name kept appearing in declassified documents. Frank declined to participate, wrote a letter explaining that his contribution had been minor, that other men had done more, that he had nothing valuable to add to the historical record. The documentary aired in 1992, mentioned Operation Stalag VII briefly, showed the aerial photographs of Stalag VII-A, noted that the intelligence retrieved from the camp had been crucial to prosecuting war crimes. Frank's name didn't appear. Helena died in 1994. Cancer. Frank continued living in the Garfield Heights house. His daughter visited weekly. His grandchildren came for holidays. In 1997, a young Marine captain knocked on his door. Special Operations Command, training officer. He'd read the 1972 manual. He'd traced the techniques back through declassified operations. He'd found Frank's name. "Sir," the captain said, "I teach close-quarters combat at Quantico. The methods we use are based on your work. I wanted to meet you, to say thank you." Frank invited him inside, made coffee, listened while the captain explained how the techniques had evolved, how they'd been refined, how they were now standard training for every Marine deploying to hostile environments. "We've probably saved hundreds of lives," the captain said, "maybe thousands, because you figured out how to do it right." Frank nodded, said little, walked the captain to the door. "Do you have any advice?" the captain asked. "Anything I should tell the Marines I train?" Frank thought about it. Thought about Uncle Max. Thought about the butcher shop. Thought about 9 Germans bleeding out in the dark. "Tell them to be precise," he said. "Tell them it's not about killing. It's about understanding anatomy, understanding structure, using that knowledge to end things quickly, cleanly, without unnecessary suffering. Tell them that violence should be the last option, but when it's necessary, it should be professional, controlled, no anger, no hatred, just technique." The captain wrote it down, shook Frank's hand, left. Frank never saw him again. In 2002, Frank moved into assisted living. His health was declining. Emphysema from 50 years of smoking, arthritis in his hands from decades of knife work. His daughter sold the house, helped him arrange his small apartment in the facility. He brought almost nothing with him. Some photographs, his discharge papers, a single boning knife from Uncle Max's shop, kept in a drawer, edge still sharp. Frank Dietrich died in his sleep on November 8, 2003. He was 89 years old. The obituary in the Plain Dealer mentioned his military service in a single sentence. He served with distinction in the U.S. Army during World War II. No mention of OSS. No mention of Bavaria. No mention of 9 guards at Stalag VII-A. The funeral was small. His daughter, his grandchildren, a few neighbors from the old neighborhood. No military honors. Frank had specified in his will that he wanted no ceremony beyond a simple burial. 3 men in their 60s attended. Former OSS colleagues. They didn't speak to the family. They stood at the back during the service. They saluted when the casket was lowered. One of them placed a challenge coin on the grave after everyone else had left. OSS insignia. Unmarked, except for a single word engraved on the reverse, precision. 6 years after Frank's death, a military historian at the Naval War College was researching silent elimination techniques for a classified study on special operations evolution. She found the 1972 training manual, traced the techniques back through operational reports, found Frank's name in declassified OSS documents. She interviewed the Marine captain who'd visited Frank in 1997. She examined German autopsy reports from Stalag VII-A. She calculated casualty rates before and after Frank's technique became standard doctrine. Conservative estimates credit Frank Dietrich's methods with saving approximately 2,400 American and Allied Special Operations personnel between 1945 and 2009. His technique reduced silent elimination operation failures by 63%. His approach to vascular targeting became the foundation for every close-quarters combat program in the Western Military Alliance. None of the reports mentioned a butcher shop in Cleveland. None of them connected the technique to civilian skills learned in childhood. The military assumed it had been developed through analysis and experimentation. But in 2011, the historian traveled to Cleveland, found the building where Max's shop had operated. It was a bodega now, windows barred, the old neighborhood unrecognizable. She interviewed elderly residents who remembered Frank, remembered Uncle Max. One old woman, 94 years old, remembered Frank as a boy. He worked in his uncle's shop, she said. Max taught him to butcher. The boy was good at it, had a feel for the work. The historian understood then. The technique hadn't originated in military training. It had originated in the practical knowledge of a working-class tradesman. It had been adapted from civilian work to military necessity. It had saved thousands of lives because a kid from Slavic village had learned his uncle's trade and applied that knowledge when it mattered. She wrote a paper, classified, distributed only to special operations commanders. The paper argued that the most effective military innovations often come not from tactical doctrine, but from individual expertise transferred from civilian contexts. That the military should look for personnel with specialized hands-on skills, mechanics, craftsmen, technicians, and find ways to adapt that knowledge to operational requirements. The paper changed nothing about doctrine, but it changed how some commanders viewed recruitment, started them asking different questions, looking for different backgrounds. Frank Dietrich's grave in Holy Cross Cemetery has no special marker. Standard military headstone. Name, rank, dates of service. Nothing about OSS. Nothing about Stalag VII-A. Nothing about the technique that became standard doctrine. But on November 8th every year, someone places fresh flowers on the grave. Different people each year, never the same person twice. All of them special operations veterans. All of them trained in the techniques Frank developed. None of them knew him personally, but they understand what he did. Understand how it changed their profession. Understand that their survival and the survival of men they trained traces back to a butcher from Cleveland who understood anatomy better than any tactical manual could teach. That's how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees or research programs, not through engineering analysis or doctrinal review. Through individuals who possess specialized knowledge and find ways to apply it when circumstances demand solutions that existing systems can't provide. Through men like Frank Dietrich, who learned precision on livestock and translated it to combat when no other option existed. The military eventually formalized his technique, put it in manuals, created training programs, assigned officers to teach it. But the knowledge originated in a butcher shop, where a 12-year-old boy learned to follow the blood and make clean cuts. That knowledge saved thousands of lives. And the man who developed it spent 58 years cutting meat in a Cleveland supermarket, never seeking recognition, never claiming credit, content to let history forget his name, as long as the technique survived. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Thank you for keeping these stories alive.